Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
I'm your host, Gene Signorini, and I'm excited for today's episode. Today's guest is a talented public speaker who is passionate mentor to her peers with a focus on advancing careers through professional development. She serves as Principal Change Consultant, Human Resources at C.H. Robinson. Please help me welcome to the show, Nikki Tollefson. Nikki, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Gene. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, this is part of our change management series. I'm very excited because it's one of those things that is so overlooked when it comes to technology, especially in this age where everybody talks about digital transformation. I think change management is one of the most overlooked things. And obviously, we like to talk specifically on our program about the deskless workforce, frontline workers. And we always like to kind of kick it off with kind of a big question, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I don't think you can answer that without thinking about just the last 18 months that everyone's been through. And specifically when I think about that deskless worker, not only have they been navigating just the heaviness, right, of the last year, they've also continued to be on the front line, right? Been the ones that have kept our systems moving and kept our country, right, moving forward. In addition to that, we continue to throw change at them, right? Like whether that's to help sustain what's happened over the last 18 months, whether that's to make them more efficient in their roles, right? But that pace of change, and I'm sure you hear this from a lot of the change people you talk to, has never been greater. And I kind of call it change whiplash, right? Like unintentionally, I think, through really, really good intentions, we throw things at them to try to help them. But we do that through so many different venues that they're trying to like keep up with it all, right? And so I really think one of the biggest challenges is just all of that change that's coming at them, trying to absorb it, trying to understand how to integrate that right into what they're doing on a daily basis in the most efficient way.
I think that's a great point, Nikki, that you bring up, which is there's so much change. And we often think about it in kind of very focused ways, which is, there's change in terms of, what you need to do in terms of your job or role. For example, how the pandemic has impacted, just the rules and regulations that they have to go through. And then on top of it, we may be implementing a new technology system, right? And on top of it, there may be a new HR system we're throwing, or payroll, or whatever it may be, right? New benefits, whatever it may be. And so I think, particularly when you've got different practitioners within an organization, right? They see it through their own lens, but they may not realize that all this stuff is stacking up. And I think that phrase change whiplash is perfect, because you can just see it's like they don't know where to look because it's coming at them from all angles. I think that's great perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really easy when you're working on your own change project that you're passionate about and is going to help the frontline workers, to make it too much of a thing, right? And not connect some of those dots. So yeah, you're spot on. It's a really easy trap to fall into.
So let's talk a little bit about, I know there's probably some of our listeners and viewers are probably not that familiar with C.H. Robinson. I'd love to kind of learn a little bit more about the company, but more specifically your role within the company as a change management practitioner.
Yeah. So C.H. Robinson is based in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, which is in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And it's one of the biggest third-party logistics, multimodal transportation services in the country and really globally as well. So when you think about a company with frontline workers and carriers and contractors, being on the front line over the last 18 months and really just helping the country continue to go. That's what C.H. Robinson has been all about.
And how has, so talk a little bit about how the pandemic has affected CH Robinson specifically. What are some of the things that you guys have had to deal with over the last 18 to 24 months?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak specifically to just, what that's meant from a change perspective,
Yeah.
right? In terms of how I think about it in my role. My role is a principal change practitioner consultant within our HR organization. And really how we've thought, how I've thought about it differently, specifically over the last year within the pandemic is really going back to what we were saying, right? Like our employees, whether they sit at a desk or they're on that front line, they're that deskless worker, have more going on than they've ever had going on before. And how I think that's shifted my approach to how I think about the work that I do is how do I make it less about my change, really, in some ways? Because again, I think we can get really, really excited about the project that we're working on. And how do I make it more about what's going to make sense for them? And really the like my guiding principle that I've tried to use over this last year specifically is don't over engineer it, right? Like keep it as simple as possible for people. Because again, I remember early in my change career, when I started out on technology implementations, every change we put out was a thing. Like we would brand the project, we would put a theme around it. Everything that we put out there was, I mean, to be honest, kind of cutesy in some ways, right? Just to make sure that people were excited about it and they were focused on it. And we're in a different world now, obviously, right? And specifically when that when that relates to change, and at least how, in my current role, how I've thought about it is, we need to be really humble in how we as change practitioners think about things anymore. It's not about making it the new shiny toy, right, for people. It's about thinking about how we connect the dots for them as we roll it out, integrate it into what they're already doing, so that we kiss, right, keep it simple
Yeah.
for them as much as possible. So for me and for my teams, that's really what we've tried to think about as things have changed over the last year.
Yeah, it's funny because, I think when people hear change management, particularly if you're not a professional change management person, you think about process, right? And certainly process is very important, right? I mean, that's part of it is instituting a process for effective change. At the same point, what I'm hearing from you is sometimes we can over process things, right? We can overcomplicate things, and try to, to over engineer things, I think is the term used. And I think that's a fantastic point. So, it's interesting. You mentioned this concept of, I think you talked about early on in your change management career on an initial technology project. One of the things we always like to understand is how did you get into what you're doing, right? What was your path to we call it your path to innovation, your path to your passion, if you will, and what you're doing now. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, path to passion. I love that. I'm stealing that. One of my favorite it's one of my favorite questions, not only to talk about, but to ask other change practitioners, because I feel like change management isn't one of those jobs that you wake up and say, this is what I'm going to go to college to do, right? You discover it later. And so I think it's just awesome how there's so many people that come from so many different backgrounds within change. So myself specifically, I worked for several different corporations over my time. Target actually was where I did a long stint and is where I started my change journey. But I like to say that I discovered change because I was the person that needed change the most when I sat in the business. I was one of the people that when a new technology would roll out, I would say, I don't have time for this. I don't know why we're dealing with this right now. I am so busy. I do not have time for this.
You were the squeaky wheel.
I was totally the squeaky wheel. Absolutely, I was. And maybe because of that, or maybe because they saw something in me, I ended up doing a stint on the best methods team for one of the businesses I worked in. And so I was all of a sudden flipped onto the project side of the coin, right? Like, hey, how do we institute more best methods? How do we, make things more consistent? And before I realized what change management was, it wasn't really even a term in the industry at that point. That's what started getting me up in the morning and getting me excited, was like cracking that nut. I like to say at that point, like, how do we get people ready for it? And we all, a lot of times we say, get them excited for it.
Yeah.
Sure. Maybe we'll get them excited for it, but like,
yeah, that new, who's going to be
them?
excited for that new finance system that you just
Exactly.
described?
Woo, yeah, exactly. So it's more just, how do we get them ready, right? How do we help them understand the why behind it? And so went through a few different roles, and really was gravitating more to project management because of that, because I knew I could dabble in that. And once I finally got my story together, though, in terms of like, what do I want to do next? I was always after the next right role. But once my story was just around less about what role do I want to go to next, and what kind of work and experiences do I want to be having? And then I started talking about the people side of it, right? Like, I love getting people ready when these things happen. I love understanding how it's going to impact them. And finally somebody said to me, I think that's a job now. And so that's ultimately how I came to change. Yeah.
And how long you've been with C.H. Robinson now?
I've been with C.H. Robinson just over a year, actually. Okay. So have been really lucky to do change in a lot of different capacities. So do it for, again, several corporations. Started focusing on technology implementations first, but then have had the opportunity to work on some pretty big transformational things, whether it's, org transformations or process transformations across different shared services. Did some consulting work for a while, dabbled in that, and ultimately loved what C.H. Robinson was doing and landed there.
So, and your current role is change management within HR.
Yep.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, we tend to think about these things in perhaps silos, right? There's HR, there's technology, there's other things, but particularly in today's world, I think they're probably colliding. How is that? How are you guys dealing with that within C.H. Robinson, for example?
Yeah, so spot on. Gosh, this relates to actually several of the last few companies I've worked for, inclusive of C.H. Robinson, in terms of how we're trying to think about change. And again, it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of, for a long time, I think, change is fairly, newer in itself as a capability, right? And when I was first working on it, we were very almost, just like in silos in some ways, which is exactly what you shouldn't be doing when you're thinking about change. But working on your own project, thinking about the perfect way to implement it, how is it going to impact your stakeholders? How do we communicate to those stakeholders? And again, as the pace of change speeds up and as people's lives get more busy and more complicated, what we've started to realize is that we need to take this step back and think about how, inclusive of, for me right now, across all of HR, as an example, right? Our changes are impacting end users and how we bring that together. But we've really also tried to think about just even in broader shared services, right? As our finance partners are rolling things out, as our technology partners are rolling things out, how do we connect the dots across all of those things, right? So that again, we avoid some of that maybe change whiplash that I was talking about when we think about our business units that are just churning and burning and getting the job done, right? Day after day. How do we bring together the changes that we across the shared services are planning to implement, how those, work together, complement each other, how we maybe sequence them in a smarter way, right? So that we are thinking about that person in the seat or on the front line and making it, easier for them to connect the dots.
Well, and it also seems that anything you touch today, for example, has a technology bent to it. Right. So if you're doing something that's HR related, if you're doing something that is organizational related, right, some sort of reorganization, restructuring, there's going to be technology change involved in that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, in many of the programs and projects I've worked on over the last few years, we look at it through kind of a few different lenses, right? And we call on some of my teams, we called it the three-legged stool, if you will, with it's, people, HR being one of them, right? Technology and the technologies that are getting implemented to help make people's lives easier is one of them. Finance, space, right? That side of the shared service is another one. And we kind of talk about, right, like if one of those stools falls down or breaks, the whole stool comes down, right? So when you relate that to what you're talking about in terms of technology implementations, right? Like, a director I work with right now really wisely says, right, like technology isn't necessarily the solution to the problem, right? It's the impetus to the solution. And if we as technology just go out there and push that solution out, right? Even if we have a great change plan around it, if we're not looking across all three of those pillars, as we call them, or those legs of the stool, to understand, right, what's that going to mean for how people behave differently? Or, how are they going to need to work differently around that technology, right? Like if we don't have those conversations and think about that across those three shared services, and then kind of harness that power, right? That power of thinking to how we actually communicate that to the end user, we're not going to be as successful as we can be, right? Rolling some of that stuff out.
Yeah. And this is definitely something I'd like to come back and touch on a little bit, which is, you mentioned so many different things right there that are involved in the change management process. I've just been going through this myself in my day job. I'm vice president of product strategy and marketing at Skillful. And we've just been instituting a new change management process for our product, the Skillful platform. Right. And you recognize how many different areas that it touches upon, right? Whether there's the communication aspects of it, there's training aspects of it, right? There's, customer success aspects of it. There's all sorts of things depending on what you're doing. So it's very interesting. So you're in, CH Robinson is in the Minneapolis area, you mentioned, and that's where you reside as well, correct?
It is. Yeah. Yep. I've been here since college. So been in Minneapolis longer than I'll admit, based on how long it's been since I graduated college. And yeah, live here with my husband and kiddos.
I won't ask you that question. I know it's always sensitive,
that.
but you did go to North Dakota State University, so you're not originally from Minnesota, correct?
I am a proud Midwest girl. Yes, grew up in Southwest North Dakota, about as Southwest as you can get. So I'll let you guys look that up on the map. And yeah, went to NDSU and then migrated over to the Twin Cities after that.
And what do you and the family like to do in Minnesota these days in your spare, when you're not trying to fix the world at CH Robinson? And what do you guys like to do?
Yeah, my husband and I joke. He grew up in Minnesota, so we're both Midwest kids, and our joke is if we're gonna live in a place that has as heavy of a four seasons as Minnesota does, you better be prepared to get outside every single one of them and enjoy them. So that's kind of the anchor to how we spend our time. So we love to get outside, to hike, to ski in the winter, to explore just new places. And yeah, sometimes I feel like I could be like an advocate for Minnesota, because it's seriously one of the most beautiful states in the world, and there's just no end to the stuff that you can discover. So yeah, we're constantly dragging our kids outside, going on hikes, doing stuff like that.
That's great. So I'd love to get back to the big challenge you talked about at the beginning, right? Which was the concept of change whiplash, which I'm going to steal for you. If you're going to steal passive passion, I'm going to have to steal change whiplash.
Fair.
But I love it. And, and then you talked about, kind of the user really kind of making it simple for them. What's kind of the feedback you've gotten from your workers? And I know CH Robinson, just has such a heavy representation of frontline workers. What's kind of the response you get to them, right? When how have they kind of manifested their either frustrations or anxieties or thoughts about this change whiplash?
Yeah. I think when I think back to every different group of frontline stakeholders that I've worked with across my career, the feedback actually continues to be pretty similar. It's just exacerbated tenfold, right? Again, based on just the environment around it now, right? So a couple of thoughts on that. I think the first one is that, what I've always heard from kind of my frontline stakeholders is that it's really easy for a change practitioner who has a desk job, right? To be totally fair, to be really, really good at thinking through, like, how am I going to engage my stakeholders? What do the impacts mean to them for other desk workers, right?
Yes.
And so just don't ever take for granted the power of making sure that very early on in your project and in your conversations around change, that you're integrating the voice of the people who are actually living it, right? And it sounds really simple, right?
Yeah.
That sounds really simple, but I think it's something we oftentimes forget, right?
And how do you do that? I mean, how do you do that? Like you said, we can all easily relate, to people who are like us, who do jobs in, sitting in front of a computer most of the day, and during the pandemic could work from home when they needed to. How do you kind of put yourself in their shoes? I think is kind of what we're relaying.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you need to build a really, really strong network of people that can help you. I kind of call it like shining your lens, right? If you remember when you were a kid and you took that light and you would really amplify it, and not on ants, hopefully, but on on those, you need to take that lens and you need to build partnerships across with people who are going to be able to sit in that space with you and put yourself in those people's shoes. And I mean, for me, it's who are my partners across HR who sit with business leaders on a day in, day out basis, right? Like HR business partners are a really great resource to tap into, because they understand, right? And sit with leaders and hear what they're trying to go after, what's important to them in their business right now, right? So that's one level of stakeholder that you need to think about how you get to. And then it's, we do a lot of listening strategies, really is what we call them, right? And it's, how are you, whether it's a focus group, whether it's a survey, whether it's, again, just getting in front of the people that are going to be able to get out on the floor, right, with some of those employees to talk about, and again, not just talk about the impact to the change that we're about to push out to them, right? It's to talk about what else is happening in your environment, right? What are you dealing with right now? Because I mean, gosh, one thing we talked a lot about, I remember a few months ago, is we were just in the dead heat of summer, right? And people were, working and out there, and it was just I would have never thought of that as a consideration to say, right, like, this is something they're dealing with on a day in, day out basis. And as we're rolling this change out, the last thing that they want to have to do is X, Y, and Z, right? Based on some of these other conditions that are happening. So it's really, I mean, change management 101 in some cases, like, put that stakeholder engagement plan together, understand who is going to be able to give you the best voice across those. Don't assume that you know best, right? And be humble would be the other piece that I've learned, and I'm still learning, is I think, again, as a change practitioner, we can get really excited about some of the ideas we have, right? That we're going to roll this out and they're going to love this, right? They're going to think like that, this contest that we're going to do, so that they really get, revved up about digging in and learning about this. That is going to fall flat because, again, of all the other things that they have going on, right? And they don't have time to focus on that. So really strong stakeholder management, strong partnerships with the people that either are living it or are hearing about it and know what they're living. And then a really, really strong dose of humility as you pull those plans together in iteration to really pass those by people, get their feedback, iterate on it, and make sure that it's landing the right way.
Now, you mentioned earlier too, this, to keep it simple, right? And not over engineer things. However, I imagine, like any practitioner, change management professional, you've kind of got a playbook that you kind of rely on, or a process that, that you try to look through to help with your consistency. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are kind of the best practices, if you will, right? In terms of and I'm sure every single initiative is different. Every project's different, but kind of what are the typical, okay, here are the things that we need to make sure we're covering as we kind of go through and build a plan for this particular initiative?
Yeah. I mean, I love this question, because to me, this is, I like to talk about change in terms of the art side and the science side, right?
So this is the science.
This is the science side. Yeah, exactly. I will say, I know, you've had people on your podcast before who, are pro-sci certified and love that ADKAR model. ACMP has a really great model that you can baseline. I kind of like to say I'm from the school of scrappiness, where I kind of take bits and pieces across all those different sources that are out there to pull together what I like best. I've also, again, been lucky enough to work at some big companies that had their own kind of change, methodology and tools that they utilized. But I think for me, what I love about what I've learned across all of those different methodologies is that at their core, they're the same. So the science piece is really at its core the same, right? It's one on the upfront. What you always have to do is understand, right? Like who are your advocates, right? So who are the leaders on the upfront that you need to get in front of and understand and get them on board, and they're going to be the voice of what you're doing. A part of that then is obviously then a really robust stakeholder engagement plan, right? Understanding whether it's people leading up to the change. I call that the setting the table stage, that you need to make sure that they understand where you're going. If you need them as advocates, they're there, right? It's that piece. But then it's, even more important, the stakeholders, leading into the change and coming out of it that are going to be impacted, right? So rooted in a strong stakeholder engagement plan. Understanding the impacts, right? Impact assessment is that science piece to really dig in, right? Like what from to, right? What the heck is going to happen to them as a part of that? Then you need to move into the actual change plan, right? And the biggest anchors of that are how you're going to engage people throughout that. How are you going to communicate to them? And how are you going to train them? Right. So it's really nailing those down. So I guess if I would distill it down to at least for me, the simplest of terms, and again, there's so much good stuff out there around, how you do that stuff and the tools that you use behind the scenes, but those are the non-negotiables to be. Now, then you have the art that sits around all of that. And that's my favorite part about change, right? Like, I really feel like when people talk to me about what makes a good change practitioner, you can teach them the tools, right? You can teach them the science part of it, but the art side of it is you need to be curious, right? About just what makes people tick. And I feel like you need to be someone who just kind of really thrives behind the scenes, right? That is just there to poke and prod and guide and lead, right? Whether that's the leaders that are on the front line of it, whether it's, again, the people that are going to have to experience the change, the project team in some ways, right? Like how you bring them together, the change person's never going to be on the forefront, like delivering the messages and speaking at the trainings or, doing any of that. Like you're really behind the scenes, helping make that happen in the right way. So you have to be passionate about that side of it too.
Well, you're clearly passionate about the entire process, but I can certainly hear the inflection in your voice go up when you're talking about the art side of it. Are there any stories you can share, like examples from your past about something that, was you kind of a creative way you kind of work through a change management process?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I would say, a really good example that I can pull is, well, first I'll start with a learning, I guess, if you'll allow me.
Yeah.
So I remember I hit a certain point in my career where, again, I was earlier on in change. Again, I didn't have 15 projects under my belt. And I remember very specifically going in to some, big leader stakeholders and having to, talk them through. It was a point in the project where we were going to say, hey, here is who's going to be impacted by this, right? And this is, this is how they're going to have to behave differently. And this is what we think we should do, right? And I leaned so heavily on the tools, right, that we use as a part of that, and the terminology, right, that we use as change practitioners as a part of that. So I went in spitballing, impact assessment and stakeholder engagement and all those buzzwords. And I was so excited because we had nailed pulling that data together and that information, and it landed flat. And again, you can tell I get excited when I talk about change, but most business leaders
why aren't you as excited as I am?
Exactly. And so For me, and again, I don't think this any of your listeners are going to say, oh, this is like the most creative idea ever, but that moment was a key moment for me and a key learning for me as a change practitioner, because I shifted my mindset of anytime I'm going in front of anyone outside of my project team, and in many cases my project team included, but especially business leadership, it is not about speaking to the science side of the change. It's about speaking to the outcome side of the change. It's about speaking to, right? And again, that's stakeholder management 101 that was just I needed to learn at that point, was that flip of mindset and that flip of phrase to, this is what you're going to get out of it, right? Like, this is what your teams are going to get out of it. This is what it means to you, as a business person. That's what you have to nail. That needs to be the wrapper when you go to market, right? In essence, all the other stuff, there's a ton of work that happens behind the scenes to get there, that science piece of it. But like, they don't care about that, nor should they care about that. They don't have time to care about that, right? Like, you need to come in and be succinct and think about it in terms of business outcomes, because that's ultimately what they need to be worried about on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And I think this is a great transition to something else I wanted to touch on, which is, the technology side of things and change management when it comes to technology. And, we've been hearing this phrase digital transformation for several years now. It's so widely used, but I also think that's one of those phrases that kind of, sounds hollow to people on the operations side, to people on the business side, right? Because digital transformation is just a term, right? And what are those outcomes that are going to impact them? And kind of what I'd like to talk a little bit about, is you've seen technology projects, you've worked on them in the past, you've been a recipient of them before you were a change management professional. What are things that you've seen have been effective when it comes to trying to implement technology change or transformational technology initiatives, and what have you seen that hasn't been very effective?
Yeah. So gosh, let's start with the what hasn't been very effective. And I'm going to hit on a couple of the things that we talked about earlier that's a part of that. But I think first and foremost, again, is getting too focused on that one specific change, your change, right?
Yep.
And again, I'm going to use the term over engineer again. So I've done it myself. I've been a part of technology implementations where we're so excited about the technology that's rolling out. It's so cool, right? That in and of itself is going to get people excited, right? So that, and then like directly tied to that again is not keeping it simple and not helping those frontline, people really understand, right? Like, this is how this is going to knit into my day to day, right? Like, I think with change, it's easy to say like, this is the new shiny thing, get excited about it. When what it really needs to be is, this is the new thing, but this is how it knits into what you already do and what that's going to mean, right? For what you already do and what you're worried about. So that kind of transitions into what I would say about what has gone well, right? When I feel like we've done a pretty darn good job with it, it's a couple of things. It's again, that true step back to understand the full landscape of what you're putting that change out into, right? Again, what's happening in the business at that particular moment? What else are they worried about? Are there any other changes that they're having to deal with, right? And really using that as the anchor to build, right, your change plan. And then I think the second thing that I've seen that we're really trying to do better to be more effective is again, how do we explain that and integrate that into processes or moments that matter to those employees that are already there, right? Like, hey guys, you'd perform this particular process. Now this is just another part of it, right? Or, oh, you have this particular moment in your day already. This is how this knits into it, right? So instead of it being this just new thing that's there, it's nope, I still have the context of what I need to accomplish in a day, what I'm worried about. And now I can start to understand how this, right, will play into that and what that might mean to what I need to do differently, but ultimately then how that's going to help me, right, achieve what I need to on a day-to-day basis versus again, day-to-day basis, change,
Yeah. Yeah, and again, Nikki, I guess you've talked a lot about really engaging those employees, communicating well, making them understand what it means for them, right, in their day to day, and also what the benefits are to them. And you can go through that whole part of it and be successful, but there's also the part of, okay, how do you get users to adopt, right, whether it's a new technology or a new process. So talk a little bit about that. How do we ensure adoption, right, for users when we're introducing anything new, any new technology, any new process?
Yeah.
What's your experience with that?
Gosh, that's $1 million question, isn't it? If we did that perfectly every time and could tell a business leader, I am going to ensure you 100% adoption by X moment, man, we'd be on a different podcast there, Gene. But I would say how we do that as effectively as we possibly can is a couple of things. Again, like, and I've covered some of these already, so I won't belabor those points, but it's again, getting, like, putting yourself in the shoes, right, of those frontline employees, not assuming, right, that we know best around how they're going to absorb it, how they're going to learn it. So that's where I always start. The second piece then is iteration, right? Like I very specifically remember the first couple of change projects that I worked on where go live would happen, right? We roll it out. The project team has a big celebration, right? Go live. And then most of the project team disbands, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, 2-3 months later, you've got business leaders saying this is not working, and they're pulling a new project team together, they're having lots of tough conversations about why it's not working, right? So that iteration piece, it has a lot that sits underneath it, right? One, it's making sure that you're starting that change process early enough where you can have those feedback moments, those listening moments, and adjust and change and shift and not be afraid to do that, right? Because the first plan we put together is I've never been in a project where the first change plan I put together was the perfect change plan. And I will have never said in my career that we implemented the perfect change plan, right? So we iterated on it leading up to rollout. And then we put a process in place so we could stay there post rollout, right? And understand, how is it really hitting? What are the challenges we're still seeing, right? And how do we continue then to follow up and make sure that we're driving that adoption as much as we possibly can.
And so to me, it sounds like it needs to be part of a continuous process versus kind of a project mentality.
Spot on.
Yeah, and we see that a lot, or I'm interested to see, we see that a lot in training, right? Which is, companies think of training as one and done, particularly in a change process where it's like, okay, we got them trained, we're good, they're ready.
Yep.
It's like it's like the circus rolls into town and then they roll out, and what's left behind in their wake, right?
Yep. Spot. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you said that, Gene, in terms of like, how do you think about it as less of a project in some ways, right? And that is certainly something that I think is important, is figuring out, right? Like, yeah, they might not have budget, right, to keep, like, really frankly, right, to keep a project team around forever. So where does that evolution live then, right? Is it in one of the shared service COEs because it's integrated as a part of a process, right, that they can continue to touch and keep their fingers on the pulse of? Do you need to find a way to embed that into the business, right, whether that's through some of your super users or different creative ways that way? But you're absolutely right, the sustainment of that evolution of how is it going, what do we need to shift and change, that has to be baked in somewhere.
Yeah. I have a question for you on, technology, flipping it around a little bit, not about implementing technology or managing change for technology projects, but are you using any technology in your change management process? Are you using technology as an enabler, for example, to communicate, to engage with users, things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, across my career and currently too, again, especially this last year, we've had to get a lot more creative with that, right? I would say, nothing super specific comes to mind, but what we do always do what we do always do is we we take a moment as we're thinking about how are we going to get the messages out there, how are we going to have the conversations, right? Like again, it's you do your impact assessment with your stakeholders in the upfront to understand, how is this change going to impact them. You need to do a similar exercise once you're talking about how you're actually going to get the messages or get the training to them, right? And then it's like shining that lens similarly, right? Like again, it's super easy on the desk front in some ways to say, well, we'll get them on a Teams call, right? We've got Teams now. This is amazing. They can ask questions, this, and that. That is not the same. That's not going to work for most of our, for our frontline workers. So again, it's taking the solution and then understanding, right, what's the best way to get that out there.
Yeah. And that was going to be one of my other questions is what's that difference between your, quote unquote desk, knowledge worker who sits in front of a computer all the time and your frontline worker who doesn't have that luxury. How have you guys tried to tackle that particular challenge?
Yeah. I mean, it's conversations with the people that know and understand what those frontline workers are doing on a day-to-day basis. And it's brainstorming with them. It's trying to get creative on what's the best way to do this. And again, I feel like one of my ahas has been, it doesn't need to be the most shiny, impressive, whatever words I'm trying to go for there, like rollout strategy, right?
Yeah.
Like honestly, in some cases, when, some of my HR business partners, again, who work with those groups on a day in, day out basis, they're like, just get them in a room together on their break and have this person talk to them. Because guess what? That's the influencer there. They're going to listen. They're going to understand. We don't need the poster on, and in some cases that's the way to do it, right? Like, let's get it up on the board. Let's get it up on the ticker. Let's do this. But a lot of those subject matter experts and those people that just, again, understand what people are going through right now have helped me take a step back and just say, like, sometimes it can be really simple too. And sometimes that's the best way to do it.
Well, I'm sure they appreciate simple because one of the things that we've discovered as well is, say you have to pull somebody, a frontline worker for training, it's delivery driver or something like that, right? That's time before their shift, or that's time after their shift, after
Absolutely.
what these days especially is a very long shift.
Absolutely.
Right? So, they are, they're always looking at their time and the management of their time, because that's always being scrutinized, especially today when we're trying to do less with more. And they're also trying to maximize their time, their personal time, right?
Totally.
On top of their professional time.
Totally. I feel like no matter what, stakeholder audience you're looking at, but especially when it comes to frontline workers, like the fundamental way that at least I started my career thinking about change and what makes a good change strategy and a change rollout plan to what I think now has completely flipped on its head. Again, like I mentioned earlier on in our conversation, like to me, when I started, and at least the examples that I saw that people would stand up as a great change plan were those, to be frank, hyper over-engineered plans that, we had themes, and every communication that went out and every engagement that we had was tied back to we spent more time thinking about how to tie that back to the theme and make it sound cool and brand it cool, right? Was what was going to get people excited. To the thought of doing something like that now, it wouldn't even close to land, because again, people would say that is so tone deaf. Like, do you know what we're having to try to get done on a day-to-day basis? And you've got me here trying to rah about a change that you're tying this cutesy theme to, that I don't even really understand what this is doing for me. So,
well, and I think there's probably a bit of, maybe suspicion, right? Then when things are kind of given, there's a whole lot of bells and whistles, it's not going to be as simple as people say it's going to be, right? That this isn't going to make my life easier. This is just going to make my life harder. And so it's kind of like the message is getting in the way, right? The marketing is getting in the way of the message you're trying to convey, at least hopefully, that this is something that we're putting in place because it should make your life easier.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's that difference of that mindset of what's being pushed down on me, which is exactly what you don't want to. Oh, they're listening to me, right? They're sitting in my space. They're giving me that space to tell, to explain what's hard, what we need help with, right? And now they're bringing me a solution that's going to help solve that for me, right? Like that shift is everything, right?
So, Nikki, I like to kind of close out typically these podcast episodes with a question. It's usually about working in technology, but I'm going to flip it to change management. And the second part of this question may be difficult for you. The first part is, what do you love about working in change management? And the second part is, what do you hate about it or not like so much, right? And it seems from what you've been talking about, it seems you're pretty passionate about it. So the list of what you love is probably very long, but if you could pick out one thing, what is it that you love about change management?
Yeah. Oh, you're right. That is tough for me, but I would say if I distilled it down, the thing that I love the most is that, like, when I describe what I do to my friends and my family, like, I get to say, every day I'm thinking about people and how I hopefully help make their jobs, their lives a little bit easier. Like that. I love everything's wrapped around that. I would say all of the things, that it's different every day, that you get to, engage with so many different people. But ultimately, I get to say that my job really is about people. And I love that. Yeah.
What frustrates you?
So I am a perfectionist, a little bit type A by nature. And so I think what I've had to learn and that what I just need to continue, like, and this is just a selfish personal thing, right? So what I need to just internalize and always remember and learn is that you never get change perfect. Right. Like you just don't. There's always something you could have done differently, always something that, you could have thought about differently. And so for someone who just is kind of ticks in this way of perfection, maybe that's part of the reason I came to it. It's just good therapy for me that then I just always realize that it's okay for there to always be something that you can do better. But that's just the nature of change. And so I think it's really good for me. But there are moments where I do struggle with that, where I'm like, gosh, I really thought that was like almost perfect, and it's not. It's never going to be.
Well, it keeps you motivated to move on to the next one, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Nikki. Where can people can, if they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way? LinkedIn?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. LinkedIn. Yep. Search Nikki Tollefson, and there I am.
Nikki Tollefson, CH Robinson. You'll find her. Are you a big tweeter? Are you on
Twitter? I am on the Twitter. Yeah. So so Nikki Tollefson on Twitter. Yep. I'm not a huge poster. If I post about anything, transparently, it's about Peloton. That's another conversation for another day.
Well, I saw you swigging out of your Peloton water bottle. The people listening couldn't see that, but I saw it. What's your Peloton handle?
My Peloton handle is Minneapolis Mama. And so if I'm being honest, if you really want to find me, that's where they're going to find it. They're going to
find you. They're going to find you in the saddle.
Yeah. In the saddle and on the tread, both.
On the tread. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, Nikki, I really want to thank you for joining us on this episode. It's been great insights. We can tell that you are absolutely passionate about what you do, and I'm thrilled that you could share that passion with our listeners. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me, Gene. It was a pleasure.
And for those listening, I hope you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. If so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. And a reminder, this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. You can visit the website at skillful.com. That's SKYLLFUL.com. And if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story. Until then, see you on our next episode.